Filipp Isaevich Goloshchekin arrived in the Kazakh steppes not simply as a party functionary, but as a man for whom murder had already become a working tool. To understand the nature of the catastrophe that unfolded in the Great Steppe in the 1930s, we must return to July 1918, to the stifling city of Yekaterinburg, where the character of the future architect of famine was forged. Goloshchekin was not just an executor, he was an ideologist of decisive action, a man for whom theory constantly demanded bloody confirmation in practice. That summer, as military commissar of the Ural region, he decided the fate of the imperial family. For him, Nicholas Romanov, his wife and children were not people, but symbols of the old world, subject to immediate disposal. This depersonalization, the transformation of living people into abstract class categories, became the basis of his subsequent behavior. Archival documents and telegrams from that period paint a portrait of a cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless man, in whom any doubts were suppressed by reference to the interests of the revolution. It was Goloshchekin who insisted that the court was bourgeois red tape, unacceptable in revolutionary times. His logic was simple and terrifying. The existence of a living symbol of the monarchy gave hope to the enemy, while death put an end to it. In this scheme, there was no room for Christian mercy or ordinary human compassion. Organizing the execution in the basement of the Ipatiev house became his baptism of fire and his professional calling card. He personally oversaw the details, coordinated actions with Moscow, and ensured the concealment of the bodies, i.e., he was involved not only in decision-making, but also in the entire technical side of the matter. This involvement shaped his specific perception of reality. Any problems are solved by physically eliminating their source. Human life in his coordinate system became a statistical error, insignificant in the face of the greatness of revolutionary necessity. Each new act of violence only reinforced his conviction that blood was an acceptable price to pay for accelerating history. The Urals taught him that cruelty is not punishable if it is covered by the mandate of the highest authority. Moreover, it is encouraged, becoming a career ladder for those who are ready to go all the way. The ability to remain unflinching when signing execution lists was valued more highly in the party than the ability to manage an economy or negotiate. In an environment where loyalty was measured by a willingness to repress, Goloshchekin felt at home. With this baggage, confidence in his own righteousness, and a habit of resolving issues through the sights of a revolver, he prepared for his new appointment. But the scale of the Urals proved too narrow for his ambitions. The party, having assessed his firm hand, decided to direct this instrument of destruction toward a much more complex object: the reform of an entire nation living according to centuries-old laws that Goloshchekin did not understand and despised, considering them a pathetic relic of the prehistoric past. In the autumn of 1925, the train carrying the new leader cut through the endless, sun-scorched expanses of Kazakhstan. The monotonous rocking of the carriages, the rare station lights, and the endless strip of horizon created the feeling of a city that stretched out in time but never became a real civilization. Filipp Goloshchekin looked out the carriage window, and the landscape beyond the glass evoked not admiration for its austere beauty, but a dull irritation. He saw yurts scattered across the steppe, herds wandering along unknown routes, and people living in the same way as their ancestors had centuries ago. In his eyes, it was chaos, archaic, savage. What for the locals was harmony with nature, for him was nothing more than lagging behind the historical process. Upon arriving in Kizil Orda, the then capital of the region, Goloshchekin was confronted with a reality that categorically did not fit into Marxist dogma. There was no classic proletariat to rely on here, no factory whistles, no working-class suburbs, no class landscape familiar to him. Nor was there any clearly expressed class hatred that could be stirred up at a moment's notice. The Kazakh aul lived by a complex system of clan ties, where the poor and the rich were often relatives, bound by mutual responsibility and centuries-old traditions of mutual assistance. Soviet power existed here only nominally, in the form of flags above administrative buildings, while real life flowed past party directives. Formal structures and living social mechanisms hardly intersected, which to Goloshchekin looked like hidden resistance rather than a different logic of social organization. For Goloshchekin, this became a personal challenge. He felt that the usual mechanisms of influence, resolutions, orders, threats, worked differently in this world, getting bogged down in the fabric of tribal relations. He felt like a missionary arriving in pagan lands, or rather, a surgeon who had to operate on a patient without asking for his consent. A dangerous, fateful thought began to form in his mind. The revolution that had thundered through Petrograd and Moscow had suffocated in the sands of Kazakhstan. It simply had not reached here, which meant that it had to be brought by force, like some kind of ready-made template. Gradually, he developed a sense of a special mission that justified any means. He sincerely believed that he was bringing civilization. But his understanding of civilization was specific. It was unification, order, subordination to a single center, the absence of unpredictability. The nomadic way of life, with its freedom of movement and elusiveness to the fiscal authorities, seemed hostile to him in its very essence. He perceived the freedom of the nomad not as a value, but as a threat to controllability. He did not see nomadism as a unique ecological niche and a complex economic model that allowed survival in a harsh climate. He saw only backwardness that needed to be burned out with a hot iron. Thus, the ideological basis for the future conflict was born: the clash between the totalitarian bureaucratic machine and the ancient steppe civilization. Goloshchekin decided that the aul needed to be Sovietized, not through evolution, but through a blow, reducing the historical path to the scale of a single-party decision. The situation in Kazakhstan in 1925 resembled the calm before the storm. The country was living in the era of the new economic policy. The economy was gradually recovering after the civil war, and relative calm reigned in the steppe. Cattle breeders were getting used to the new authorities, without, however, abandoning their traditional forms of self-organization, which allowed them to survive crop failures and droughts. Local party cadres, often consisting of the national intelligentsia, tried to adapt Soviet slogans to local realities, trying not to break the backbone of the traditional way of life. They understood that any sudden movement in a nomadic economy could cause a chain reaction, and therefore preferred cautious reforms. But Filipp Goloshchekin, having barely taken up the post of first secretary of the Kazakh Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, perceived this calmness as a betrayal of the ideals of October, as a capitulation to feudal remnants. In his first reports and speeches, he lashed out at local communists. He declared that there was not a whiff of Soviet power in the Kazakh owl, that feudal domination reigned there, and that clan ties were replacing party discipline. For him, any respect for tradition automatically meant political unreliability. Goloshchekin, a man of action and radicalism, could not tolerate half measures. He wanted war, class struggle, mass unrest, everything he had seen in Russia in 1917-1918 and perceived as the only correct way to transform society. Peaceful transformation seemed suspicious and incomplete to him, as if the revolution had failed. It was then, at the end of 1925, that he formulated and introduced into the political lexicon the ominous term Little October. It was not just a clever turn of phrase, but an ideological framework that allowed the upcoming campaign to be presented as a legitimate continuation of the Great Revolution, rather than the arbitrary act of a single party leader. The essence of the concept was monstrous in its simplicity. If there had been no real October Revolution in Kazakhstan, if the class struggle there had not reached the intensity of civil war, then this situation had to be created artificially. It was necessary to instigate conflict where there had been none. Goloshchyokin proposed to carry out a small October as a full-scale campaign to destroy the traditional structure of Kazakh society. Under the slogan of finishing off the feudal remnants, he actually planned to redistribute people, land, and power without regard for the consequences for the living fabric of society. When analyzing his personality, historians often point to his past. The man who cold-bloodedly organized the execution of the royal family in July 1918 had a specific professional deformation. He was accustomed to solving problems by eliminating their sources, rather than by changing the conditions that gave rise to them. In Yekaterinburg, the problem was the dynasty. He destroyed it. In Kazakhstan, the problem was the entire way of life of the nomads. His radicalism was not spontaneous. It was a well-calibrated methodology of Bolshevik terror, in which violence was perceived as an inevitable and even beneficial catalyst of history. He did not understand, and did not want to understand, the specifics of nomadic cattle breeding, where the Bey was often not an exploiter, but an organizer of the production process, ensuring the survival of the clan in harsh climatic conditions. It was easier for him to label the Bey a class enemy than to understand the intricacies of the relationships within the owl. For Goloshchekin, the owl was analogous to a Russian village, only even more wild. He mechanically transferred the templates for combating the kulaks to a terrain where these templates did not work, as if he were trying to treat a complex organism according to a textbook written for a different species. But the desire to sweep through the owl with a broom was not enough. To implement a plan that implied social upheaval across a vast territory, approval from the very top was required. And Goloshchekin knew who to turn to. His experience working in the party apparatus had taught him that the main thing was to obtain the leader's approval. The rest could be finished off using local methods. The history of the greatest tragedies is often written not on the battlefields, but in the quiet of offices, through dry memos. It was precisely such a bureaucratic act that triggered the Kazakh catastrophe. Realizing that local officials, such as Smagul Sadvakasov and Zhalao Minbayev, would resist his radical ideas, Goloshchekin decided to enlist the personal support of Joseph Stalin. He deliberately bypassed the intermediate levels, turning his program into a matter of personal trust between the regional leader and the supreme authority. He sent an extensive memorandum to Moscow, in which he masterfully manipulated facts and ideological clichés. Goloshchekin convinced the leader that without destroying the old social order, it would be impossible to build socialism in Kazakhstan. Any element of tradition in his text was interpreted as a potential hotbed of counter-revolution. The key point of his argument was the need to settle the Kazakhs. In this logic, settlement was synonymous with controllability, accountability, taxation, everything that facilitates state control over the people. Why did this argument work? For Moscow, nomads had always been inconvenient subjects. A nomadic owl is a mobile unit that is difficult to register, difficult to tax, difficult to control, and even more impossible to fit into the framework of a planned economy. Nomads were too free. In the paradigm of the totalitarian state that Stalin was building, such an elusive element posed a threat. From the center's point of view, freedom of movement could easily turn into freedom of thought. In addition, the center needed resources, grain, meat, wool, on an industrial scale, rather than in the form of barter, which was not subject to planned figures and delivery schedules. After reading Goloshchekin's arguments, Stalin gave his famous reply, which essentially became a death sentence for millions. Goloshchekin's policy is the only correct policy. This short phrase meant a lot. Approval of violence, willingness to turn a blind eye to local peculiarities, agreement to sacrifice an entire civilization for the sake of the greater good. It was a complete carte blanche. With Stalin's approval, Goloshchekin turned his regional initiative into state policy. Now, any resistance to his actions was interpreted not as an economic dispute, but as counter-revolution and opposition to the party line. The political will of the center coincided with the ambitions of the governor. The mechanism of repression, which had previously been used selectively, now had the opportunity to act on entire regions without regard for individual fates. In his correspondence at that time, Goloshchekin often used wartime terminology. He wrote about the need to blow up the owl from within and organize a civil war in the steppe. These were not metaphors. He was actually planning a military operation against his own people, only instead of front lines, there would be lines of class division. Having received permission for the Little October, he began to methodically implement it. And he began with a blow to the very foundation of life in the steppe, the land, depriving people of their usual way of interacting with the space on which their existence depended. The period from 1926 to 1927 went down in the history of Kazakhstan as the time of the redistribution of arable and haymaking lands. It was the first tentative blow of the Little October, aimed at destroying the economic base of traditional society. Goloshchekin acted on the principle of formal justice: take from the rich and give to the poor. However, in the context of nomadic farming, this Marxist slogan turned into a theater of the absurd. The idea, which looked humane in abstract terms, in practice resulted in the destruction of a complex system of interaction between people, land, and livestock. The facts testify to the scale of the campaign. In just 2 years, about 1,360,000 desiatins of hayfields and 1,250,000 desiatins of arable land were forcibly seized from wealthy farms. These colossal tracts of land were transferred to the poor and middle peasants. It would seem to be a triumph of social justice, but in reality, it was economic sabotage. The redistribution took place without taking into account the real possibilities of the new owners to use the land, without analyzing how the change in land boundaries would affect traditional livestock routes. The problem lay in the specifics of the steppe economy. Land in the steppe is only valuable in conjunction with livestock. Wealthy farms, bai, owned the best pastures and watering places precisely because they had huge herds that needed to be fed. These herds, in turn, ensured the survival not only of the owner, but also of numerous relatives and dependents. The poor, to whom Goloshchekin generously allocated hectares of land, often had neither livestock nor tools for cultivating the land, nor even seeds. In their hands, the land became an empty, formal resource that could not be turned into bread and meat without startup capital. The result was a paradoxical and tragic situation. The best pastures, jailao, and hayfields transferred to the poor stood empty. There was no one to eat the grass and no one to mow it. And the herds belonging to the expropriated bais were driven onto unsuitable land, salt marshes, and waterless areas where the cattle began to die of starvation. Conflicts over water sources intensified, and the balance between man and the landscape, which had been established over centuries, was disrupted. Where decisions had previously been made at gatherings and took into account the opinions of elders, now everything was determined by a stamp on paper and the signature of an authorized representative. But the most terrible consequence was the disruption of centuries-old migration routes. Nomadic cattle breeding is a complex logistics operation honed over centuries. North in spring, south in winter, strictly along specific corridors to allow the steppe to recover. Goloshchokin's land redistribution cut through these routes like a knife cuts through arteries. Artificial boundaries were established and seasonality was disrupted. Chaos began to engulf the steppe. It was not yet famine, but it was the destruction of the foundation on which life depended. People watched with alarm as their familiar landmarks, wintering grounds, summering grounds, spare pastures, became foreign territory that could no longer be entered without the risk of being declared a trespasser. But taking away the land and disrupting the economy was not enough for Goloshchokin. He needed to divide society from within, setting brother against brother, son against father. If the land redistribution was a blow to the economy, the next phase of the operation was a blow to the soul of the people, to their moral core. Goloshchokin understood that as long as the authority of the elders, aksakals, and clan leaders remained in the aul, the Soviet government would be powerless. It would be perceived as an external force, not as its own power. He needed social support, a fifth column within Kazakh society itself. This support was to come from a new group whose loyalty was based not on tradition, but on personal gain and fear of punishment. This is how the artificially inflated union Koshchi, plowman, was created. By the end of the 1920s, more than 230,000 people had joined its ranks. Most of them were poor villagers, marginalized groups, people deprived of property and influence in traditional society. They had nothing to lose in the old system, so they readily accepted the promises of the new one. The authorities gave them not just union membership cards, but also the right to use violence and a sense of impunity. For many, this was their first experience of power over their neighbors, relatives, and those who had been unattainable authorities just yesterday. Goloshchekin launched a social engineering mechanism aimed at fabricating class hatred. Propaganda began to mold the image of the enemy from the bay, a parasite, a bloodsucker, an exploiter. Although in reality, the Kazakh bey was often the guarantor of survival for his poor relatives, providing them with livestock for rent or helping them with food during harsh winters. This complex system of mutual assistance was declared a feudal relic. Words memorized from party brochures gradually replaced living memories of how, in the recent years of famine, the Bai had shared his last horse or ram to save the owl. As part of the Little October policy, the mass confiscation of the property of semi-feudal beys began. But the worst thing was not the seizure of livestock, but the eviction. People whose ancestors had lived on this land for centuries were forcibly expelled from their areas of residence. It was a severing of ancestral roots. The Bai, deprived of everything, was thrown out into the bare steppe or sent into exile, and his property was plundered by Koshchi activists. For yesterday's poor, the combination of envy and thirst for revenge, with official approval from above, created an explosive mixture in which moral constraints were quickly erased. The psychological effect was devastating. The humiliation of respected people, the destruction of the hierarchy, the encouragement of informing, all this demoralized the people. The owl ceased to be a unified organism. Fear settled in every yurt. People did not understand where the line of what was permissible lay, and therefore preferred to remain silent, to distance themselves, and not to help those who were under attack. Goloshchekin successfully implemented the principle of divide and rule, creating the atmosphere of civil war in the steppe that he had so long dreamed of. Having prepared the social ground, deprived the people of their leaders and economic independence, Filipp Goloshchekin moved on to the most brutal phase of his operation, total collectivization, which would turn into total plunder and genocide. For the Kazakh steppe, 1928 was the year when the premonition of disaster gave way to disaster itself. While the land redistribution only shook the foundations, the grain procurement campaign initiated by Goloshchekin turned into a direct military intervention against his own people. From that moment on, violence ceased to be disguised as reform and became an open practice of the state. The steppe, accustomed to seasonal rhythms and a patriarchal way of life, was confronted with a phenomenon that did not fit into any traditional framework. An army of strangers poured into the owls and winter camps. It was a planned personnel expansion. On Goloshchekin's personal orders, 4,812 authorized representatives were sent to the Kazakh regions. This figure, almost 5,000 people, conceals the colossal scale of administrative violence. Who were these people? Most of them were activists sent from the cities, industrial workers, komsomol members, and party functionaries who were completely unfamiliar with the language, culture, or peculiarities of nomadic life. They were told that they were going to pacify saboteurs and root out class enemies, which justified any methods in advance. Each of these representatives had a mandate that gave them virtually unlimited power. In the conditions of the roadless steppe and remoteness from the center, such a person became a king and god, prosecutor and judge in one person. His decisions were rarely reviewed, and complaints about him almost never reached higher authorities. Their task was formulated in extremely harsh terms: to seize grain at any cost. Officially, the campaign was called surplus procurement, but the very concept of surplus was interpreted arbitrarily by the commissioners. For nomads, whose livelihoods balanced on the edge of survival in a harsh climate, there were practically no reserves. Everything they had was intended to feed their families and preserve their livestock during the winter. However, The collectors were not interested in the logic of survival. They were guided not by the real needs of the people, but by the figures in the plan handed down from above. The methods used by these units resembled those of occupying forces. Upon arriving in a village, the representative would first summon the poor and form committees of the poor, kombody, from among the local marginalized population. These people, often embittered and without their own farms, were given carte blanche to search and confiscate property from their neighbors. The principle of material interest worked flawlessly. Some of the confiscated property and food was allowed to be kept or transferred to the Kombed Fund. This gave rise to a wave of looting under the guise of revolutionary slogans. Activists ransacked yurts, opened storage pits, and took not only grain, but also felt, household utensils, silver jewelry, anything of value. The concept of the class enemy became a convenient cover for satisfying personal greed. However, it soon became clear that there was simply not enough grain in the livestock-raising regions to meet the quotas set by Alma-Ata. Then the wheel of repression turned again. A substitution of concepts began. Instead of grain, they began to demand meat. The logic of the authorities was simple and deadly. No grain? Then hand over your livestock according to the grain coefficients. This was the beginning of the end. For Kazakhs, livestock was not just food. It was their main capital, transport, source of clothing and fuel, dung. The confiscation of livestock for grain procurement meant certain death. In one fell swoop, economic confiscation and the condemnation of an entire economy were combined. In 1928, local arbitrariness reached grotesque proportions. Archival documents preserve evidence of how officials staged public trials of those who could not meet the quota. People were doused with water in the cold, put in pits, and threatened with execution on the spot. Psychological terror complemented economic terror. In a number of areas, for example, in the Semipalatinsk district, officials introduced their own taxes, taking away the only milking cow from large families. In response, the steppe was set in motion. Spontaneous migrations began. People tried to save their livestock by fleeing to the remote sands, the mountains, or attempting to break through to the border with China. But here, too, barrier troops awaited them. The border areas turned into war zones, where unarmed owls tried to escape persecution by armed OGPU detachments and Koshchi activists. By the end of 1928, the traditional economy had been disrupted, trust in the authorities destroyed, and the supplies needed for wintering taken away or looted. People's inner peace was filled with a sense of hopelessness. The state, which had promised justice, had become the main source of danger. However, the most terrible blow was not the confiscation of grain, but the insane idea of forcing nomads to settle on the land in a single day. If 1928 was a year of plunder, then 1930 was a year of death sentences. It was during this period that the policy of the Little October reached its peak, in the form of a directive on the transition to a sedentary lifestyle. In the offices of Alma-Ata and Moscow, an idea was born that was striking in its economic illiteracy and cruelty: to convert centuries-old nomads to a sedentary lifestyle in the shortest possible time. What would normally take centuries of economic evolution, Goloshchekin decided to accomplish in a few months, guided solely by ideological dogma. In the eyes of the party apparatus, the very possibility of accelerating the historical process seemed to be proof of the power of the authorities. The 1930 directive on collectivization based on settlement prescribed the consolidation of scattered owls into single points, so-called settlement points. On paper, this looked like the construction of new socialist settlements with schools, hospitals, and permanent housing. Bureaucratic reports painted an idyllic picture of a civilized village, where yesterday's nomads were supposedly happily transitioning to higher forms of economic management. In reality, it was the herding of people and livestock into a barren field. Local authorities, eager to curry favor and exceed their quotas, the infamous counter plans, pointed to a spot on the map in the steppe where hundreds of families, along with their herds, were forcibly herded under the escort of police and activists. No one seriously considered whether there was water, food supplies, or conditions for building housing there. The consequences of this measure were immediate and catastrophic. Steppe cattle breeding was based on constant movement. The herd would graze on one area and then move on to another, allowing the pasture to recover. The concentration of thousands of head of cattle in a limited area of settlement led to ecological collapse in a matter of weeks. The grass within a radius of several kilometers was trampled and eaten down to the roots. The animals, deprived of the opportunity to move to new pastures, began to starve. Not only did the economic system break down, but so did the very logic of man's relationship to space. Where once the nomad was the master of the route, he now became a prisoner of a randomly chosen point on the map. Overcrowding provoked instant outbreaks of epizootics. Disease mowed down thousands of weakened animals. But even more terrible was the lack of food. In the winter of 1930 to 1931, the steppe was covered with the carcasses of horses, camels, sheep, and cows. The OGPU archives of that time recorded horrific scenes. Mountains of fallen livestock, which no one could remove, poisoned the air and water. The death of animals became part of everyday life, and the smell of carrion was a constant companion in the settlement points. People deprived of their livelihoods found themselves trapped. They could not leave. It would be considered escape and counter-revolutionary activity, but staying meant death. The choice was between quick and slow destruction. There was no food or shelter prepared in the settlement points. People, accustomed to mobile yurts, were forced to dig dugouts in the frozen ground, trying to shelter from the steppe winds. Mass deaths began, not only of livestock, but also of people. It was at this moment that the Great Famine, Isaevich, began. A nomad without livestock in the steppe is a person deprived of a means of survival. The food chain was broken. No meat, no milk, no skins for clothing. Every horse or cow lost meant not only a reduction in the herd, but also a reduction in the family's chances of surviving the winter. During the hungry months, moral taboos collapsed. People ate roots and carrion and took desperate measures just to keep their children alive. Forced sedentarization destroyed the very biological basis of the Kazakh ethnic group. The statistics on the decline in livestock numbers look like a report from the front lines of a nuclear war. Of the 40 million head of livestock that existed in the Republic before the start of collectivization, by 1933 there were barely 4 million left, a tenfold reduction. These were not just numbers in reports. They were extinct villages, orphaned children, and the madness of hunger that engulfed a vast territory from Altai to the Caspian Sea. Every percentage point of this decline had a human face, names that will never be recorded in the books of memory. Goloshchekin's directive disrupted the fragile balance between man and nature that had been maintained for centuries, turning flourishing pastures into graveyards. The steppe, which until recently had fed people, now became a place of death. The catastrophe reached such proportions that it became impossible to hide even for Stalin's system, which usually forgave excesses. The career of Filipp Goloshchekin, architect of the Little October, ended as did that of most executioners of that era, ingloriously and bloodily. The man who signed directives condemning millions to death with cold indifference became himself an item on the execution list. However, it is important to understand that the Soviet authorities did not punish him for the genocide of the Kazakh people. In the logic of Stalin's system, the destruction of people for the sake of socialist construction was not considered a crime if it brought results. Goloshchekin's crime was that he failed to meet economic targets and allowed a political scandal to erupt, causing mass emigration abroad and uprisings that had to be suppressed by the regular army. He became inconvenient not as an executioner, but as a failed manager. In 1933, when the scale of the disaster in Kazakhstan became apparent even to Moscow, largely thanks to the courage of the local intelligentsia and the famous Letter of Five that revealed the truth about the genocide, Goloshchekin was quietly removed from his post and transferred to another job, Chief State Arbitrator at the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR. It was an honorable exile. The party seemed to be saying, "You went too far, but you're one of us." This transfer allowed them to maintain the appearance of loyalty to their old comrade, while removing him from a region that had become a humanitarian disaster zone. He continued to live in comfort, while wolves gnawed on the bones of his victims in the Kazakh steppe. But the wheel of repression, set in motion in part by his own hands, continued to turn, demanding new blood. The system he served knew no gratitude and made no exceptions, even for particularly deserving executioners. The end came in 1939. On the 15th of October, Goloshchekin was arrested. He was charged with a standard set of offenses for that time: sympathy for Trotskyism, participation in an anti-Soviet organization, and preparation of terrorist acts. Among the charges were excesses in collectivization, but these were interpreted as sabotage aimed at turning the population against the Soviet government. The irony of fate was that Goloshchekin was accused of doing what he did with Stalin's own approval, but now it was presented as his personal arbitrariness. The man who yesterday referred to the party line today became a convenient scapegoat on whom part of the responsibility could be pinned. He spent 2 years in prison, subjected to the same interrogation methods that his subordinates had once used on Kazakh beys and national propagandists. Another circle was closed. The executioner became a victim of his own practices. He wrote letters to Stalin, Yezhov, and Beria, reminding them of his merits, the execution of the Tsar's family, and his merciless fight against the enemies of the people. He tried to evoke a sense of corporate solidarity in them, appealing to their shared past, to the blood he had shed on their orders. But the system was death. He was spent, a witness to too many secrets of the regime's formation. The existence of such witnesses always posed a danger to a power built on fear and secrecy. The denouement came in October 1941. German troops were advancing on Moscow, and the evacuation of prisons began. Goloshchyokin, along with a group of other high-ranking prisoners, was taken to Kuibyshev, now Samara. There, in the turmoil and panic of wartime, without trial or investigation, on Beria's orders, he was shot on the 28th October 1941 in the village of Barbish. The man who dreamed of starting a civil war in the steppes received a bullet in the back of the head in a dirty ravine, far from the places of his bloody glory. His body was thrown into a common grave, And for many years, the place of his burial remained unknown. Thus, the circle of violence was complete. The man who considered himself the arbiter of fate turned to dust in the camp. History gave him neither a tribunal nor the opportunity to justify himself. Only a short queue, similar to those he himself had once sanctioned. Goloshchyokin disappeared into oblivion, but the scars left by his Little October remained on the body of the nation forever. History had passed its judgment, but the price paid by the people was exorbitantly high. The consequences of the Little October and the subsequent Ashar Shailik were not limited to the 1930s. It was a demographic catastrophe, the echoes of which can still be heard a century later. According to various estimates, Kazakhstan lost between 1.5 and 2 million people, almost a third of its titular nation. Entire families and clans were wiped off the face of the earth, and genealogical lines that had been traced for centuries were broken. Each lost family is a tragedy invisible to the world, but together they form a wave that changed the very face of the nation. The deserted steppe became a terrible monument to one man's ambitions and a cannibalistic system. Vast territories were depopulated. Where life had once been bustling, children's laughter rang out and horses neighed. Now there was only dead silence. It took decades for the Kazakh population to simply return to its 1926 level. This demographic collapse cannot be compensated for. These are unborn children, unwritten books, unfinished discoveries. Along with the people, the cultural code was also lost. The old storytellers, the experts in oral traditions, the bearers of unique knowledge about the steppe, died. With their death, not only family histories were lost, but also the subtlest nuances of language, customs, and folk ethics. Traditional culture, having suffered such a blow, changed forever, losing many of its facets. The survivors carried with them severe psychological trauma, a fear of hunger that was passed on to subsequent generations at the genetic level. The Little October did not just thin out the population, it dealt a blow to the gene pool, the consequences of which are still felt today. A distrust of any sudden reforms from above became ingrained in the subconscious of the nation. Concluding this grim excursion into history, we must clearly understand why it is important to remember these events and call things by their proper names. For a long time, Filipp Goloshchekin remained a controversial figure in Soviet historiography, but he was still considered a party man. Streets were named after him, and his merits in establishing Soviet power were noted in textbooks. People preferred to remain silent about the tragedy of Ashar Shailik or speak in hints, hiding living people behind impersonal phrases about the difficulties of the transition period. But the truth, breaking through the concrete of oblivion, put everything in its place. Little October was not a mistake, an excess, or a dizzying success. It was a crime against humanity. Goloshchyokin went down in history not as a reformer, but as a symbol of misfortune, a byword for heartlessness and fanaticism. His actions showed how fragile human life is in the face of the totalitarian machine. And if you think it is important to remember these pages of history, please support this video with a like and a subscription.